My husband staged an intervention after I told him I wanted a divorce. What happened next made me question everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and whether the person sleeping next to me every night was actually trying to save me or control me. My name is Natalie, and I'm 32 years old. 6 years ago, I thought I had found my person, my safe harbor in this chaotic world. I met Caleb when I was 26, working as a graphic designer at a small creative agency in Denver. He was 30 at the time, the kind of man who commanded attention without even trying. We met at a bookstore on a Sunday afternoon. I was browsing the psychology section, trying to understand more about my recent autism diagnosis, when this guy approached me holding a copy of the same book I'd been considering. "Good choice," he said, his voice warm and confident. "I read this one last year. Really opened my eyes to how differently people's minds work." There was something genuinely curious in his expression, not the usual awkwardness people showed when the topic of neurodiversity came up. We ended up talking for 3 hours, sitting cross-legged on the floor between the shelves, discussing everything from books to travel to our shared love of terrible reality TV shows. Caleb was charming in an effortless way. He made me laugh until my sides hurt, remembered every detail of our conversations, and had this incredible ability to make me feel like I was the most fascinating person in the room. He was studying to become a physical therapist, passionate about helping people recover from injuries, and the way he talked about his work made my heart skip. Here was someone who genuinely cared about making others feel better. Our first real date was at this tiny Italian restaurant downtown. He'd researched places with quiet corners because I'd mentioned that crowded, noisy spaces could be overwhelming for me. That attention to detail, that consideration for my needs, it felt like I'd finally found someone who truly understood me. We talked about our dreams, our fears, our families. He told me about his childhood in Michigan, how his parents had divorced when he was 12, and how he'd promised himself he'd never put his future wife through that kind of pain. "When I commit to someone," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand, "it's forever. Through everything." The way he looked at me when he said those words made me feel safer than I'd ever felt in my life. The early days of our relationship were like something out of a romantic movie. Caleb would surprise me with my favorite coffee on rough mornings, leave little notes in my sketch pad, and spend entire weekends with me binge-watching shows and ordering takeout. He embraced my quirks, my need for routine, my sensory sensitivities. When I had meltdowns from overwhelming days at work, he'd sit with me quietly, sometimes for hours, just being present without trying to fix anything. He proposed 2 years later on the hiking trail where we'd had our first serious conversation about the future. It wasn't elaborate or public, just him and me and the Colorado mountains stretching out behind us. "I want to spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never doubt how loved you are," he said as he got down on one knee. I said yes through tears, believing with every fiber of my being that I'd found my forever person. Our wedding was small and perfect. Both sets of parents were there, though mine seemed a bit overwhelmed by Caleb's more boisterous family. His parents, Tom and Linda, were the kind of people who filled every room with their presence. They meant well, but they had strong opinions about everything and weren't shy about sharing them. During the reception, Linda pulled me aside and said, "You're so lucky to have found Caleb. He's always been our golden boy, you know. We just want to make sure you take good care of him." At the time, I thought it was sweet, if a little old-fashioned. The first few years of marriage were everything I'd hoped they would be. We bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, adopted a cat named Winston, and fell into comfortable routines that worked for both of us. Caleb was building his physical therapy practice, working long hours but always making time for us. I was thriving at the agency, winning awards for my designs and finally feeling confident in my career. But looking back now, I can see the first tiny cracks starting to form around year 3. It started with small things, comments that felt almost like jokes but left me feeling slightly off balance. When I'd spend a weekend afternoon working on personal art projects, he'd walk by and say, "Still playing around with your little drawings?" with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. When I'd get excited about a book I was reading or a documentary I'd watched, he'd listen for a minute before checking his phone or changing the subject. The changes were so gradual that I convinced myself I was being oversensitive. After all, everyone said marriage took work, right? People grew and changed, and maybe we were just settling into a more realistic dynamic after the honeymoon phase. Caleb was still affectionate, still told me he loved me every day. He just seemed more tired, more stressed about work, more focused on practical things like our mortgage and retirement savings. "You're so sensitive about everything," he'd say when I'd try to talk to him about feeling disconnected. "I'm working myself to death to build us a good life, and you're worried about whether I seem enthusiastic enough about your hobbies?" He'd pull me into a hug after saying things like that, kissing the top of my head and murmuring apologies. "I'm sorry, baby. Work has just been crazy. You know I support everything you do." The first time Caleb really lost his temper with me was about 4 years into our marriage. I'd forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning, something that had completely slipped my mind during a particularly overwhelming week at work. When he realized his favorite shirt wasn't ready for an important client meeting the next morning, he exploded. "How could you forget something so simple?" he shouted, his face red with frustration. "I asked you to do one thing, Natalie. One thing. I work 60-hour weeks, and I can't even count on my wife to remember a basic errand." The words hit me like physical blows. I tried to explain that I'd been struggling with executive function issues lately, that my brain had been foggy and unfocused, but he cut me off. "Don't give me that autism excuse again," he snapped. "You manage to remember everything that matters to you just fine. You never forget about your art supplies or your therapy appointments or that book club you go to. This is about priorities, and apparently, helping your husband isn't one of them." I stood there in our kitchen, tears streaming down my face, feeling like I'd been slapped. This wasn't the man who'd sat with me through panic attacks, who'd researched autism for months after my diagnosis to better understand my needs. This was a stranger wearing my husband's face. He apologized later that night, brought me flowers the next day, and we never talked about it again. But something had shifted. I started walking on eggshells, creating elaborate reminder systems for myself, triple-checking everything I was supposed to do. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was disappointing him constantly, that I was failing as a wife. The episodes became more frequent over the next year. He'd blow up over dishes left in the sink, over plans changing at the last minute, over my need for quiet time when I was overstimulated. Each time, the same pattern would follow: explosive anger, cruel words about my excuses and limitations, followed by apologies and promises to do better. I started to believe that maybe he was right. Maybe I was using my autism as a crutch, maybe I wasn't trying hard enough to be the wife he deserved. My breaking point came 8 months ago. I'd been struggling at work for weeks, feeling increasingly overwhelmed by deadlines and office politics. My sensory sensitivities were getting worse, making the open office environment feel like torture. I was having trouble sleeping, forgetting to eat, and my executive function was deteriorating rapidly. One morning, I couldn't get out of bed. Couldn't. My body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and even the thought of showering or getting dressed felt impossible. I called in sick, thinking I just needed a mental health day. But one day turned into 3, then a week. My boss, thankfully, was understanding when I finally explained what was happening. She'd seen burnout before and immediately put me on medical leave, insisting I take the time I needed to recover. But recovery wasn't as simple as I'd hoped. The depression that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Getting dressed felt like climbing Mount Everest. Grocery shopping left me exhausted for days. I slept 12 hours a night and still woke up tired. My doctor diagnosed me with severe burnout complicated by my autism, explaining that neurodivergent people often experienced burnout more intensely and took longer to recover. Caleb's reaction was not what I'd expected from the man who'd promised to love me through sickness and health. At first, he was sympathetic, bringing me tea and telling me to rest. But as weeks turned into months, his patience evaporated. He'd come home from work to find me still in my pajamas, the house messy, dinner not made, and his frustration would boil over. "What did you do today?" became his daily greeting, spoken with barely concealed irritation. When I'd try to explain that I'd managed to shower and do a load of laundry, he'd shake his head like I was making excuses. "Other people work full-time jobs and still manage to keep their houses clean," he'd mutter, loud enough for me to hear. The worst part was how he talked about our sex life, or lack thereof. My libido had completely disappeared during the burnout, something my doctor had warned might happen. But Caleb took it personally, making comments about how I never wanted to be intimate anymore, and how he felt like he was living with a roommate instead of a wife. "I have needs too, you know," he said one evening after I'd turned down his advances again. "I'm working myself to death, taking care of everything, and I can't even get affection from my own wife. How is that fair?" The guilt was crushing. I tried to force myself to be intimate even when I didn't want to, but it left me feeling hollow and used. As months passed, Caleb's frustration turned into anger, and his anger turned into cruelty. He started questioning every aspect of my condition, suggesting that I was exaggerating my symptoms or using them as an excuse to avoid responsibilities. When I'd have meltdowns from overstimulation, he'd accuse me of being dramatic. When I struggled to complete household tasks, he'd list all the things he'd accomplished that day while dealing with my limitations. "You're not the woman I married," he said one evening, the words dropping between us like stones. That woman was independent, creative, full of life. Now you're just this. He gestured vaguely at me, sitting on the couch in my pajamas, and the contempt in his voice was unmistakable. I started crying almost daily, never sure if the tears were from the burnout depression or from the constant criticism and disappointment in my husband's eyes. I felt like I was drowning, and the person who was supposed to throw me a life preserver was holding my head underwater instead. The idea of separation first occurred to me about 4 months ago. I was lying in bed, listening to Caleb rant about the dishes I'd left soaking in the sink, when I suddenly thought, what if I didn't have to listen to this anymore? The thought was so unexpected, so contrary to everything I'd believed about our marriage, that it startled me. But once the idea was planted, it grew. I started imagining what it would be like to live alone, to not have someone cataloging my failures every day, to not feel like a burden to the person who was supposed to love me most. Maybe Caleb would be happier without me. Maybe I'd be happier without the constant pressure to be someone I couldn't be right now. When I tentatively brought up the idea of a trial separation, Caleb's reaction was immediate and intense. "Are you insane?" he shouted. "You can't even take care of yourself right now, and you want to live alone? You'd fall apart completely without me." He reminded me of our wedding vows, specifically the "in sickness and in health" part, telling me that as my husband, he had a legal obligation to take care of me, and I had an obligation to honor our marriage. "This is just your depression talking," he said, his voice becoming gentler but somehow more condescending. "You're not thinking clearly. When you get better, you'll realize how ridiculous this sounds." He refused to consider the possibility that maybe our marriage was part of what was making me feel worse, not better. 2 weeks ago, I finally found the courage to say the words that had been building inside me for months. We were sitting at the breakfast table, Caleb scrolling through his phone while eating cereal, when I said quietly, "I want a divorce." The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb looked up slowly, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and then rage. "What did you just say?" "I want a divorce," I repeated, my voice stronger this time. "I can't do this anymore, Caleb. We're making each other miserable." What happened next was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Caleb completely lost control, screaming at me with a fury that was terrifying. He threw his bowl across the kitchen, the ceramic shattering against the wall. He called me selfish, ungrateful, mentally unstable. He accused me of abandoning him when he needed me most, of being weak and pathetic. "You think you can just give up when things get hard?" he yelled, his face inches from mine. "You think you can just walk away from 6 years of marriage because you're sad? You're sicker than I thought if you believe anyone else would put up with your issues." The verbal assault lasted for hours, with Caleb alternating between screaming and crying, between threats and desperate pleas. He told me I was having a breakdown, that I wasn't capable of making rational decisions in my current state. He said he wouldn't let me destroy our marriage over a temporary mental health crisis. Eventually, he exhausted himself and broke down sobbing, apologizing for his reaction but insisting that divorce wasn't the answer. "We just need to get you better," he kept repeating. "Once you're yourself again, we'll be fine. We'll be perfect again." But I wasn't backing down this time. A few days later, when he tried to pretend the conversation had never happened, I brought it up again. "I meant what I said, Caleb. I want a divorce." His reaction was just as explosive as before, maybe worse. This time, he punched a hole in our bedroom wall. That's when he started making phone calls. Yesterday morning, I woke up to the sound of voices in our living room. Confused and still groggy, I put on my robe and walked out to find Caleb sitting with 4 other people, his parents, Tom and Linda, and my own parents, Robert and Carol. The sight of them all there, looking at me with expressions of concern and pity, made my stomach drop. "Sweetheart," my mother said, standing up and approaching me like I was a wounded animal. "We're all here because we love you and we're worried about you." Tom, Caleb's father, cleared his throat. "Caleb told us what's been going on, Natalie. About how you've been isolating yourself, how you've been hurting yourself." I stared at him in confusion. Hurting myself? I'd never done anything to hurt myself. "We know you're struggling," Linda added, her voice saccharine with false sympathy. "But you don't have to go through this alone. We're all here to support you and help you get back to being yourself." I looked around the room at these people who claimed to love me, all of them looking at me like I was broken, like I was the problem that needed to be fixed. My father, who'd always been uncomfortable with emotional displays, couldn't even meet my eyes. My mother was wringing her hands, clearly believing whatever story Caleb had told them. "What exactly did you tell them?" I asked Caleb, my voice barely above a whisper. "I told them the truth," he replied, his tone measured and reasonable. "That you've been depressed and isolated, that you're not taking care of yourself, that you've been having thoughts of self-harm." The last part was a complete lie, and the casual way he said it made me feel sick. That's not true, I said, looking at my parents. I've never hurt myself or threatened to hurt myself. I'm dealing with burnout and depression, but I'm not suicidal. Denial is part of the process, Linda said gently. We understand that you might not see how concerning your behavior has been. But we're all here because we love you, and we can see that you need help. For the next 2 hours, I sat in that living room while 5 people discussed my mental health, my marriage, and my future like I wasn't even there. They talked about stability, about the importance of having support during difficult times, about how divorce wasn't the answer when someone was mentally compromised. Every time I tried to speak, to defend myself or explain my perspective, I was gently redirected or told that my judgment wasn't reliable right now. You need to focus on getting better, my mother said, taking my hand. And you can't do that if you're making major life decisions while you're not well. Caleb is your husband, and he's committed to helping you through this. That's what marriage is about. I cried through the entire intervention, feeling trapped and humiliated and completely powerless. These people who claimed to love me had already decided that I was too sick to know what was best for myself, that my desire for divorce was just a symptom of my mental illness rather than a rational response to an unhappy marriage. When everyone finally left, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. Caleb found me curled up on our bed, still in my robe, staring at the wall. I know that was hard, he said, sitting down beside me. But it was necessary. Everyone can see how much you're struggling, and we all just want to help you get better. Then he dropped the real bombshell. I called Dr. Peterson and Dr. Martinez, he said, referring to my family doctor and my therapist. I explained what's been happening, how you've been talking about self-harm and divorce, and they both agree that you need more intensive treatment. My blood ran cold. What do you mean, you called them? You can't discuss my medical information without my permission. I'm your husband, he said simply. They're concerned about you too. Dr. Peterson thinks you should see a psychiatrist, and I've already made you an appointment for next week. Dr. Martinez wants to increase the frequency of your sessions. I stared at him, finally understanding the full scope of what was happening. He'd contacted my medical team, my family, his family, and painted a picture of me as someone who was dangerous to herself, someone who couldn't be trusted to make decisions about her own life. And they'd all believed him. You told them I was hurting myself, I said quietly. That's not true. You're hurting yourself by talking about divorce, he replied. You're hurting yourself by isolating and not taking care of your health. Maybe not physically, but emotionally, mentally. And I couldn't just stand by and watch anymore. The manipulation was so complete, so thorough, that for a moment I almost believed him. Maybe I was being irrational. Maybe my depression was making me think terrible thoughts about our marriage. Maybe everyone else could see something I couldn't. But then I remembered the months of criticism, the anger over unwashed dishes, the accusations that I was using my autism as an excuse. I remembered feeling like I was walking on eggshells, like nothing I did was ever good enough. I remembered the contempt in his voice when he told me I wasn't the woman he married. I want to go to these appointments, I told him. But I'm going to tell them my side of the story. Of course, he said, stroking my hair. I want you to be completely honest with them. They need to understand everything you're going through so they can help you get better. He seemed so sincere, so concerned, that if I hadn't lived through the past several months, I might have believed he truly wanted to help me. But I knew better now. I knew that getting better in Caleb's mind meant becoming the wife he wanted again, not actually addressing the problems in our marriage. That night, lying in bed next to my husband who'd just orchestrated an intervention to prevent me from divorcing him, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Part of me still loved him, still remembered the man who'd made me feel safe and understood. But that man felt like a stranger now, replaced by someone who'd rather control me than lose me. I started thinking about my options. My parents clearly thought I was too fragile to live alone, but maybe that was exactly what I needed. Maybe some time away from Caleb, away from the constant pressure and criticism, would help me think more clearly about what I really wanted. I thought about my Aunt Rebecca, my mother's sister, who lived about 3 hours away in Portland. She'd always been the rebel of the family, the one who'd divorced her first husband when everyone said she should stick it out, who'd started her own business at 50 when everyone said she was too old. Maybe she'd understand what I was going through in a way my parents couldn't. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that everyone around me was treating this like I was having a breakdown, when really, I was finally starting to wake up. For months, I'd been questioning my own perception, wondering if I was being too sensitive or expecting too much from my marriage. But the intervention had shown me how far Caleb was willing to go to avoid facing the problems between us. I decided that I would go to the psychiatric appointment, but I'd also start making plans to spend some time with Rebecca. I needed space to think, to remember who I was outside of this marriage, to figure out if the woman who wanted a divorce was mentally ill or just finally ready to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. The next morning, Caleb was unusually attentive, bringing me coffee in bed and asking how I was feeling. Better, I told him, which wasn't entirely true but seemed to be what he wanted to hear. Good, he said, kissing my forehead. Dr. Martinez wants to see you this Thursday, and the psychiatrist appointment is Monday. We're going to get you the help you need. I nodded, letting him believe that his plan was working, that I was falling in line with his version of what was best for me. But inside, I was already planning my escape. Not from getting help. I knew I needed support for my depression and burnout, but from the suffocating control that was being disguised as care. Later that day, when Caleb was at work, I called Rebecca. Her voice was warm and familiar, immediately putting me at ease. Natalie. What a nice surprise. How are you doing, honey? I found myself crying before I could even answer her question. Through my tears, I told her everything, about the burnout, the depression, Caleb's increasing anger and criticism, the intervention, the way everyone seemed to think I was too sick to know what was best for myself. Rebecca listened without interrupting, occasionally making soft sounds of sympathy or understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. You know, sweetheart, when I was going through my divorce, everyone told me I was making a mistake. They said I should be grateful to have a husband who provided for me, that I was being selfish for wanting more than that. It took me years to realize that wanting to be happy and respected in my marriage wasn't selfish at all. But what if they're right? I asked. What if I'm not thinking clearly because of the depression? Depression can make everything feel hopeless, Rebecca said gently. But it doesn't necessarily make your judgment about your relationship wrong. Has Caleb been supportive during your burnout? Has he made you feel loved and cared for, or has he made you feel like a burden? The question hit me like a revelation. Like a burden, I whispered. Definitely like a burden. Then maybe the problem isn't your mental health, honey. Maybe the problem is that you're trying to recover from burnout while dealing with someone who's making you feel worse about yourself instead of better. We talked for another hour, and by the end of the conversation, I felt more clear-headed than I had in months. Rebecca invited me to come stay with her for a few weeks, no questions asked, whenever I was ready. You need space to heal, she said. And you can't do that if you're constantly being told that your feelings and perceptions are wrong. That evening, when Caleb came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, feeling calmer than I had in weeks. He seemed pleased by my mood, interpreting it as a sign that his intervention was working. You seem better today, he observed, sitting down across from me. I am, I said simply. And for the first time in months, it was true. Not because my depression had suddenly lifted or because I decided to stay married, but because I finally had a plan that felt like mine instead of something being imposed on me. I'm proud of you for agreeing to get help, Caleb continued. I know it was hard to hear yesterday, but everyone really does just want what's best for you. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without revealing what I was really thinking. What would be best for me, I was beginning to realize, might be very different from what Caleb and our families thought was best for me. Over the next few days, I played the part of the compliant wife who was committed to getting better. I went to my therapy session with Dr. Martinez and was completely honest about everything that had been happening, not just my depression and burnout, but also the problems in my marriage, Caleb's reaction to my request for divorce, and the intervention. Dr. Martinez listened carefully, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. At the end of the session, she looked at me seriously. Natalie, I want to be very clear about something. While you are dealing with depression and burnout, I don't see any evidence that you're having thoughts of self-harm or that your judgment is impaired to the point where you can't make decisions about your own life. Your desire for divorce may be related to your current mental state, but it could also be a rational response to a marriage that isn't working for you right now. I started crying with relief. Finally, someone was validating what I'd been feeling instead of telling me it was all in my head. What I'm concerned about, she continued, is the way your husband characterized your condition to your families and to your medical team. Some of what he described doesn't match what I've observed in our sessions or what you're telling me now. She recommended that I continue with therapy twice a week, but also suggested that I might benefit from some time apart from Caleb to focus on my recovery without the additional stress of trying to meet his expectations. When I got home and told Caleb about the session, I carefully edited what Dr. Martinez had said, focusing on her recommendation for continued therapy and leaving out her concerns about our marriage. He seemed satisfied, already planning how this would fit into his narrative of helping me get better. The psychiatric appointment on Monday was similarly revealing. Dr. Adams, the psychiatrist, spent over an hour with me, asking detailed questions about my symptoms, my history, and my current situation. Like Dr. Martinez, she seemed concerned about the discrepancy between how Caleb had described my condition and what she was seeing in front of her. "You're certainly dealing with depression and burnout," she told me. "And I think medication might help with some of your symptoms. But I want to be clear that wanting to change your life circumstances, including your marriage, isn't necessarily a symptom of mental illness. Sometimes it's a sign that you're starting to advocate for yourself." She prescribed an antidepressant and recommended that I continue therapy, but she also suggested that I consider whether my current living situation was conducive to recovery. "Healing happens best in environments where you feel safe and supported," she said. "If you're constantly feeling criticized or like you have to prove your worth, that's going to make recovery much more difficult." After the appointment, I sat in my car in the parking lot and called Rebecca. "I want to take you up on that offer," I said. "I need to get away for a while." "Of course, sweetheart. When?" "Soon. Maybe this weekend. I need to figure out how to tell Caleb without him losing his mind." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "You know, honey, you don't necessarily owe him a detailed explanation. You're an adult, and you have the right to make decisions about where you spend your time and energy. If you think he'll try to stop you or make you feel guilty for leaving, maybe it's better to just go." The idea of leaving without a big confrontation was appealing, but it also felt like running away. I decided to try talking to Caleb first, to see if I could make him understand that I needed some space. That evening, I approached the conversation carefully. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Martinez and Dr. Adams said about creating a supportive environment for recovery," I began. "And I think it might be helpful for me to spend some time with Rebecca in Portland. Just for a few weeks, to focus on getting better without any distractions." Caleb's expression immediately hardened. "Distractions? Is that what I am to you now?" "That's not what I meant," I said quickly. "I just think some space might be good for both of us. You've been under a lot of stress too, dealing with my depression. Maybe we both need a break." "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "You're not well enough to be on your own right now, and Rebecca is a bad influence. She's been divorced twice, Natalie. She's going to fill your head with more ideas about giving up on our marriage." "I'm not giving up," I lied. "I just need some time to focus on my mental health." "You can focus on your mental health here, with your husband who loves you and wants to help you. Running away to your aunt's house isn't recovery, it's avoidance." The argument escalated from there, with Caleb becoming increasingly agitated as he realized I was serious about leaving. He accused me of using my mental health as an excuse to abandon our marriage, of being selfish and ungrateful. He threatened to call my parents, to tell them I was having another episode. "Fine," I said finally, feeling exhausted and defeated. "I won't go." But I was lying. I'd already made up my mind. If Caleb wouldn't support my need for space, then I'd have to take it without his permission. The next day, while he was at work, I packed a suitcase with enough clothes for a few weeks. I wrote him a letter explaining that I needed time to work on my mental health away from the stress of trying to be the wife he wanted me to be. I told him I'd call him in a few days, once I'd had some time to think. I left the letter on the kitchen counter, loaded my car, and drove to Portland. The 3-hour drive gave me time to think about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. The intervention, the appointments with doctors who saw through Caleb's manipulations, the realization that my desire for divorce wasn't a symptom of mental illness but a rational response to an unhappy marriage. When I arrived at Rebecca's house, she took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug that lasted several minutes. "You did the right thing," she said simply. "Now let's focus on helping you remember who you are." The first few days at Rebecca's were difficult. Caleb called constantly, alternating between angry voicemails about how I'd abandoned him and tearful pleas for me to come home. He texted my parents, telling them I'd run away and was having a breakdown. He even called Rebecca directly, demanding that she send me home. Rebecca handled him with a calm authority that impressed me. "Natalie is an adult who asked for some space to work on her mental health," she told him. "I'm not sending her anywhere. If you're concerned about her well-being, maybe you should think about why she felt the need to leave in the first place." After a week, the constant contact from Caleb began to taper off, though he still sent daily texts asking when I was coming home. I started ignoring most of them, focusing instead on the therapy sessions I was having via video call with Dr. Martinez and on the simple pleasure of waking up each morning without immediately feeling like I was disappointing someone. Rebecca's house was quiet and peaceful, with large windows that let in lots of natural light and a garden that she tended carefully each morning. She worked from home as a freelance editor, so she was around if I needed company but gave me space when I wanted to be alone. For the first time in months, I slept well. I ate regular meals without someone commenting on what or how much I was eating. I took long walks through Rebecca's neighborhood without feeling guilty about not being productive. Slowly, gradually, I started to feel like myself again. You know, Rebecca said one evening as we sat on her back porch drinking tea, you seem so much more relaxed than when you first got here. Your whole posture is different. She was right. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been carrying myself until I started to relax. I'd been walking through my own life like I was braced for impact, waiting for the next criticism or explosion. After 2 weeks in Portland, I had a revelation during a therapy session with Dr. Martinez. She asked me to describe the difference between how I felt at Rebecca's house versus how I'd been feeling at home with Caleb. Here, I feel like I can breathe, I said. I don't have to monitor my every action to make sure I'm not disappointing anyone. I can have a bad day without someone taking it personally or getting angry at me. I can focus on getting better instead of trying to prove that I'm not as sick as everyone thinks I am. And how does that make you feel about your marriage? She asked gently. Like maybe the problem isn't just my mental health, I admitted. Like maybe the reason I can't get better at home is because I'm trying to recover in the same environment that helped make me sick in the first place. It was a painful realization, but also a liberating one. For months, I'd been trying to fix myself so I could be the wife Caleb wanted. But maybe the problem wasn't that I was broken. Maybe the problem was that I was trying to fit into a relationship that no longer worked for either of us. That evening, I called Caleb for the first time since I'd left. He answered on the first ring. Natalie? Thank God. Are you okay? When are you coming home? I'm okay, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Actually, I'm better than I've been in months. And I'm not ready to come home yet. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Caleb spoke again, his voice was tight with controlled anger. What do you mean you're not ready? You've been gone for 2 weeks. I've been worried sick about you. I know, and I'm sorry for leaving the way I did. But Caleb, I need you to understand something. Being here, having this space, it's helping me see things more clearly. I'm sleeping better, eating better, feeling less anxious. And that's telling me something important about our situation. It's telling you that you're running away from your problems instead of dealing with them, he snapped. You can't heal by hiding at your aunt's house. You need to come home and work on our marriage. Maybe our marriage is part of what I need to heal from, I said quietly. The explosion that followed was immediate and intense, even through the phone. Caleb screamed about abandonment, about how I was destroying everything we'd built together, about how I was being influenced by Rebecca's toxic feminism. He accused me of having an affair, of planning this all along, of using my mental health as an excuse to justify leaving him. You're sick, Natalie, he yelled. You're not thinking clearly. This isn't you talking, it's your depression. You need to come home now so we can get you real help. I held the phone away from my ear until his rage exhausted itself. When he finally stopped shouting, I spoke calmly. Caleb, I'm going to stay here for another 2 weeks. I'm continuing therapy, I'm taking my medication, and I'm working on my recovery. But I'm doing it in an environment where I feel supported instead of criticized. We can talk again after that. If you don't come home this week, I'm filing for divorce myself, he threatened. I won't be married to someone who abandons her family when things get tough. Maybe that would be for the best, I said, the words surprising me as they came out of my mouth. After I hung up, I sat on Rebecca's couch and cried, but they weren't the desperate, hopeless tears I'd been crying for months. They were tears of grief for the marriage I'd thought I had, mixed with relief that I was finally being honest about what I wanted. Rebecca found me there an hour later and sat down beside me without saying anything. Finally, she asked, how do you feel? Scared, I admitted. But also, free? Is that terrible? My marriage is falling apart, and part of me feels relieved. It's not terrible at all, she said gently. Sometimes the thing we're most afraid of losing is the thing that's been holding us back from being happy. Over the next few days, I started thinking seriously about what I wanted my life to look like. Not what Caleb wanted, not what our families expected, but what would actually make me happy and healthy. The picture that emerged didn't include walking on eggshells or constantly defending my mental health needs or trying to be someone I wasn't. I called my parents and had an honest conversation with them for the first time in months. I explained that while I was dealing with depression and burnout, I wasn't having a breakdown. I told them about the problems in my marriage, about feeling constantly criticized and unsupported, about how much better I was feeling away from that environment. My mother was resistant at first, clearly still believing Caleb's version of events. But he loves you so much, honey. He's been calling us every day, worried sick about you. Marriages go through rough patches, especially when someone is dealing with mental health issues. Mom, I said firmly, loving someone doesn't mean you get to control them or make them feel terrible about themselves. Caleb may love me, but he doesn't respect me or trust me to know what's best for myself. That's not the kind of love I want to live with. It took several more conversations, but gradually my parents began to understand. My father, who'd always been uncomfortable with emotional discussions, surprised me by calling a few days later. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me. "About feeling criticized all the time. That's no way to live, sweetheart. Your mother and we just want you to be happy. If being with Caleb isn't making you happy, then maybe it's time to consider other options." The support from my parents meant everything to me. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like people were listening to me instead of just deciding what was best for me. After a month in Portland, I made my decision. I called a lawyer and filed for divorce. Not because I was having a mental health crisis, but because I deserved to be in a relationship where I felt valued and supported instead of constantly inadequate. Caleb's reaction was predictable. He contested the divorce, claiming I was mentally incompetent to make such a decision. He submitted statements from his parents about my unstable behavior and tried to get copies of my medical records to prove I was having a breakdown. But I had statements from Dr. Martinez and Dr. Adams confirming that while I was being treated for depression and burnout, I was fully capable of making informed decisions about my life. I had documentation of the progress I'd made during my time away from Caleb. Most importantly, I had my own voice, finally strong enough to advocate for myself. The divorce proceedings were difficult and painful. Caleb alternated between trying to win me back and trying to punish me for leaving. He told everyone who would listen that I'd abandoned him during his time of need, conveniently forgetting that it was supposed to be my time of need. But throughout it all, I felt stronger than I had in years. Living with Rebecca, then eventually getting my own small apartment in Portland, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of trying to be the perfect wife. I started drawing again, something I'd given up because Caleb had made me feel silly for playing around with art. I made new friends who knew me as I was now, not as half of a couple. The hardest part was dealing with the people who thought I was making a mistake. Some of our mutual friends sided with Caleb, believing his narrative that I'd had a breakdown and destroyed a perfectly good marriage. Even some of my extended family thought I was being selfish, that I should have tried harder to work things out. But I also discovered that there were people who'd been quietly concerned about my marriage for years. My college roommate confessed that she'd always thought Caleb was too controlling. A coworker mentioned that she'd noticed how anxious I seemed whenever Caleb called me at work. It was validating to learn that my perceptions hadn't been completely off base. The divorce was finalized 8 months after I'd first asked for it. I felt a complex mix of emotions sitting in that courthouse, officially ending a relationship that had defined my adult life. There was sadness for the dreams that hadn't worked out, relief that the fighting was over, and excitement about the possibility of building a life that truly fit who I was. Caleb made one last attempt to reconcile after the papers were signed. He showed up at my apartment with flowers and a long letter about how he'd realized his mistakes and wanted to try again. For a moment, looking at this man I'd once loved so deeply, I almost wavered. But then I remembered how it felt to wake up every morning wondering what I might do wrong that day. I remembered the intervention, the way he'd lied about my mental state to control me, the months of feeling like I was drowning while the person who was supposed to love me held my head underwater. "I hope you find happiness, Caleb," I told him. "But it's not going to be with me. We're not good for each other, and we probably haven't been for a long time." He left angry, but he left. It's been a year now since I walked into my living room to find my husband and both sets of parents staging an intervention to keep me from divorcing him. A year since I felt so powerless and confused that I almost believed I was too sick to know what was best for myself. The woman I am today feels like a completely different person from the one who sat crying in that room, feeling trapped and humiliated. I'm still dealing with autism and the occasional bout of depression, but I've learned the difference between mental health challenges and being in a relationship that makes those challenges worse. I live alone now in a sunny apartment near Rebecca's house. I work part-time as a freelance graphic designer, which gives me the flexibility to manage my energy levels and sensory needs. I have a small circle of friends who understand and accept my neurodivergent traits instead of seeing them as character flaws to be fixed. Most importantly, I've learned to trust myself again. That voice inside me that said I deserved better, that said my marriage was making me sicker instead of helping me heal, that voice was right all along. It wasn't depression talking or mental illness clouding my judgment. It was my authentic self, finally strong enough to speak up for what I needed. The intervention that was supposed to save my marriage ended up saving me instead. Not by forcing me to stay in a relationship that was slowly destroying my sense of self, but by showing me how far some people will go to maintain control when they feel it slipping away. I think about that sometimes, how different my life might be if I'd let them convince me that wanting a divorce was just a symptom to be treated rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. I might still be walking on eggshells, still trying to shrink myself to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. Instead, I'm here, in my own space, writing my own story. I'm not the woman Caleb married, that's true. I'm not the compliant, grateful wife who put his needs above her own well-being. I'm someone stronger, someone who knows her worth, someone who refuses to accept love that comes with conditions and criticism. The intervention failed because you can't save a marriage by convincing one person that their desire to leave is a mental health crisis. You can't love someone back to health while simultaneously making them feel sick for wanting something different. What saved me wasn't staying and trying harder. What saved me was learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for the other person, is to admit when something isn't working and have the courage to walk away. I still believe in marriage, in partnership, in finding someone to share your life with. But now I know what that should look like. It should feel like coming home to yourself instead of losing yourself. It should make you feel stronger, not smaller. It should be built on respect and understanding, not control disguised as care. The woman who wanted a divorce wasn't broken or confused or having a breakdown. She was finally, after years of silence, telling the truth about what she needed to be happy. And the most important thing I learned from this whole experience is that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is listen to that voice and trust it, even when everyone else is telling you it's wrong. My husband staged an intervention to save our marriage, but what it really did was show me that I was worth saving too. Just not in the way he thought, and not in the relationship we had built together. Sometimes the intervention you need isn't the one designed to keep you where you are, but the one that gives you permission to become who you're meant to be.